Hello everyone, Vulcan here to finally bring you my review of RWBY Volume 4. The format of this video will be slightly different from the usual. In my episodic reviews, I normally talk about my impressions of the episode, what happened in it, and give some general insights, which later would be supported by theory videos. This video will instead be covering what I believe are the key aspects of the volume individually, which are the story and writing, followed by the animation, and finishing off with sound, music, and voice acting. Story and animation are going to make up the bulk of this review, seeing as they're the largest factors for which RWBY is recognized for, and also because I feel like I have more to say about those aspects than anything else. I'll also be giving a score out of 10 for each of these elements after I talk about them. So to start this off, let's talk about the story. The writing of Volume 4 unfortunately has a number of problems, most of them stemming from the poor handling of the time skip. This was handled badly enough that in a recent RTX, Rooster Teeth even retconned the 6 to 8 month skip to make it a vague amount of time after Volume 3, which essentially leaves it to the interpretation of the fans. This in and of itself is a problem. When creating a piece of writing, you don't want to leave it to the readers to decide what's happening and what shouldn't be happening. Headcanons should remain what they are and not be made into real canonical fact. Because once you leave it to the readers to decide what is what, that ends up creating more consistency issues because no one can really tell what's happening anymore. For instance, I might say the story is taking place 1 or 2 weeks after Volume 3, while someone else will say that it's been a few months, and yet another person will say that it's close to a year later. Having a time skip in the first place isn't a problem, but when the interactions that occur during Volume 4 feel like the kind you'd expect to happen a short time after the events of the previous part of the story, you start to wonder if the time skip is actually accurate. A good example of this is when Whitley's first introduced in the story. His conversation with Weiss felt like the kind they should have had when Weiss first got back to Atlas after the fall of Beacon. Here I'm talking about lines such as, "I thought you always hated winter," or "You're not the only one who's grown after you left for Beacon." Those sound like the kind of lines they'd say to each other after meeting for the first time since Weiss arrived at Beacon, so that was a very long time ago now. They're not the kinds of things they'd say when Weiss has already been in Atlas for half a year living in the same place as Whitley. They had to have seen each other during that gap in time. And speaking of Atlas, why did Ironwood say that their academy would be back in session soon? What happened in Atlas itself that led to its own academy having to shut down for so long? One other thing that didn't sit well with me was how Sun was pegged as a stalker who'd been following Blake for half a year. Now, under any other circumstance, I wouldn't blame them. Following someone around without letting them know for that long is at least a little creepy, I will admit that. However, bear in mind that it was not at all Rooster Teeth's intention to portray him that way, especially if you consider the way Sun has been around Blake ever since. This is all due to the fact that the time skip was handled terribly. So to avoid making Sun look like a stalker as per their intention, it would have been much better for the skip to have been a lot shorter. And never mind that it doesn't make any sense that Blake manages to get on a boat to Menagerie after 6 months. I mean, what was she doing before getting on the boat that it took her that long to decide to go home? Considering nothing was mentioned regarding the gap, I'd say nothing important, which further makes me question whether or not the 6 to 8 month skip was even necessary. And another final example, I promise, although I could really bring up more, is RWBY questioning the length of their journey well into Volume 4, thinking it would have taken them a few weeks rather than what it was really taking them. You'd think that RWBY would have started questioning the length of the trip long before the half-year mark. Additionally, I'd have expected the trip to be shorter as well, even considering that they're going on foot. People have walked across the US in times ranging between 2 to 7 months depending on their speed. And these were regular people, so you can expect hunters and huntresses in RWBY to be significantly faster than that even on foot. So a few weeks to a couple of months would have been sensible, especially when you compare that to the time it took Yang to arrive to Kuroyuri at the end of the volume with her bike. You can also compare that to the few weeks it took Tyrion to get from Oniyuri to Salem's Palace, which is supposedly in the Dragon Continent northwest of Sanus. Setting aside the time skip and the questionable time of Ranger's journey, there are other issues I have with the writing. One particular issue I've had was how certain things that happen in the volume were not addressed by the end of it or simply given a passing mention. The most glaring example is the end of episode 2 when RWBY had nightmares of Pyrrha and Jean training during that night to Pyrrha's recording. Addressing this event later in the volume with an interaction between Jean and RWBY would have been ideal. You'd think RWBY would want to talk about Jean's nightly training as well as the fact that she's been dreaming about Pyrrha screaming his name. It would have been the perfect opportunity for development between RWBY and Jean. However, at the end of the volume, RWBY only says she's seen what losing someone important does to people. I can guess this was a reference to episode 2, and this again is another example of how the writing leaves it to the fans to interpret things. I've always strongly believed that Jean training to Pyrrha's recording recording was his way of coming to terms with having lost her, and his actions later in the volume support this, particularly when he reassures RWBY that he and the rest of Juniper chose to follow her and never blamed her for what happened before and during the journey. However, I've seen numerous fans in various places say that Jean's training showed he actually can't get over her, and RWBY's mention of it in her monologue supports this view. You might also say that RWBY's referring to herself, as there was a previous mention of Penny in the volume, not to mention RWBY herself was having nightmares as stated earlier. Or it could even be a reference to Ren, considering what happened in the few episodes prior to this, which showed how much he wanted to not talk about what happened in Kuroyuri and therefore his childhood, and how Ren was almost so consumed by vengeance that he was literally going to throw his life away trying to kill the Nakalavi. The volume presented many opportunities for the end of episode 2 to be addressed, particularly during the scene where Jean was reassuring RWBY just before the final boss battle, or even after Crow was finished telling the story of the four maidens and how they tried to transfer Amber's power over to Pyrrha. RWBY could have potentially asked Crow if it was possible something of Pyrrha passed on to her as a result of the failed transfer, thus explaining why RWBY's remembering things she shouldn't in her dreams. Now, I've covered the problems I have with this volume extensively, but that doesn't mean to say that there weren't any good things about it. So to showcase this, I want to talk about the character development. What I've already said about RWBY so far more or less covers my thoughts on her. In short, I feel more could have been done with RWBY, as some things that happened to her that could lead to character development weren't addressed. However, I do feel that she has started to see development, which I strongly appreciate. RWBY has been in need of development for quite some time, and at the end of the volume, her reason for being a huntress essentially takes form. Early in volume 1, RWBY states that she wanted to become a huntress because she was inspired by the stories of heroes and fairy tales. Blake responds to this saying that the real world is completely different, to which RWBY retorts saying that that's why hunters and huntresses exist, to make it so that the world does reach a state closer to that of fairy tales. This was before the fall of Beacon, witnessing the destruction of Oniyuri, and facing enemies who are a threat to the world itself. All these things would have been enough to crush someone's spirit, or at least make them more cynical like Crow appears to be. But RWBY held on to her belief, and her reason for being a huntress became stronger for it. Moving on to Jean, what I said about part of RWBY's development being skipped over from episode 2 also applies to Jean, since the scene had a lot to do with him as well. It simply would have been nice to get confirmation about how he's coping with Pyrrha's loss either way. It may get addressed in the next volume, but as I said, volume 4 provided several opportunities for this. Additionally, considering how important the show is making him out to be, he hasn't really shown a great deal of development in this volume. Although I did appreciate it for what it was, especially in episode 10 when he reassures RWBY that he doesn't feel like he was dragged into RWBY's wild goose chase against his will. And that's what makes me think that Jean is in fact getting over her rather than being stuck thinking about her and what could have been. It shows that he is in fact moving forward. The end of the volume also showed him looking at his armament, undoubtedly thinking about Pyrrha considering her weapons were used to upgrade his. That is until Ren and Nora arrive. This scene showed me he does understand there are other people still important to him for whose sake he must keep moving forward. I also liked Ren a lot since the first few episodes of the volume because we were beginning to see more of his character beyond the aloof portrayal he received in the first 3 volumes. His flashback also shed a lot of light on why he behaved the way he did when Ranger came to a split decision between traversing the mountains or going toward Kuroyuri. Going from someone who wanted to forget the past and what happened to his parents to someone who both accepted it and fought for those who were close to him now was a development that was great to see. Nora's role was really important to achieve this. It was thanks to the role reversal that took place between the flashback episode and the final one, where Nora went from being the scared one to the one who kept a clear head, that allowed for Ren's turning point. And most important of all, Renora is official, and unlike Arcos, it did not sink with a tragic death. Sorry Dishwasher, but your prediction failed this time. Moving on to Weiss, I thoroughly enjoyed her development in this volume. My biggest gripe is only that her time on screen was complexively too short throughout the volume. But even in such a short time, I was really happy to see how she progressed. The turning point for her was at the party during the charity event. Before that, she appeared to have been resigned to the fact that Beacon was gone and that she'd have to bear living with her father until she could inherit the company. When Jacques decided that it would instead be Whitley to inherit the Schnee-Does company, I think that was the moment when Weiss realized she had to choose her own way and not try to walk a path that was laid out in front of her, even if only in part. Despite all the adversities she faced due to her father and her brother, she still wanted to move forward and make her own path, so I'm really excited to see what Weiss will do in the next volume. Blake's development was really something that I, and I'm sure sure many others expected would happen. Initially, she didn't want to fight the White Fang and simply wanted to go home to straighten out her thoughts. After realizing the White Fang was not going to leave her alone, as well as how more of her friends would get hurt as a result of this, she decided to bring the fight to them. Sun was a huge factor in her development, particularly in episode 11. One of the biggest hurdles Blake had to face was coming to terms with the fact that her friends would get hurt for her sake and that she didn't have to feel responsible for their choosing to do so. When Sun woke up in episode 11, Blake explained to him she left her friends behind so they wouldn't get hurt again. But Sun came back at her saying it's his choice to protect her at the risk of his life and he'd do it again without a second thought, and Yang would obviously do the same. Deep down, I think Blake knows this and that's why she ran away, but now she's accepting that she can't stop them from making their choice to put their lives on the line and that she can't make that choice for them. In the end, rather than being alone, she decided instead to fight alongside her friends and comrades to reform the White Fang and make it peaceful once more. Yang's development is something I've heard a number of fans express disappointment with, saying that it was too rushed. However, I maintain what I said in my video on RWBY's character development. It's true that at present Yang appears to have fully recovered from her PTSD, which is why there are those who feel her development in this volume was rushed. On the other hand, I think it's still possible that she hasn't, or at least not completely. Training with her father and getting used to her new arm certainly seemed to have helped her getting back into the fighting mood. But the mention of Adam on TV, the incident with the glass, and her nightmare showed that she isn't afraid of Adam himself, but rather afraid of her powerlessness. This was shown more clearly during the nightmare, which started out with Yang in her then present condition without the arm. She then notices that the arm and her weapons are back as Adam approaches her. Her attempts to attack him failed completely, and before long she was back to missing her right arm. I think what this said about Yang was how afraid she was that whether or not she had both arms, she couldn't do a thing. But now that she's trained with her father, some of that fear is of course going to be gone, but one should also consider that Yang has not yet been in another situation similar to what happened in Beacon, that being a life or death situation. We will see for certain how Yang is doing once she is in such a situation again, and I still feel there is potential for her to grow now. If nothing else, I'm just a tad disappointed that we didn't get to see more of Best Girl in this volume. One other character that was introduced in this volume that I feel I really should be talking about is Oscar. Oscar is a very interesting character because he's someone who apparently comes from nowhere but is given a huge responsibility. Much of this stems from the fact that he's essentially the Luke Skywalker of RWBY, that is, a farm boy who is destined for a great many things. However, I will say that I was disappointed with his development, and a lot of this has to do with how little screen time he's given. Considering he's supposed to inherit Ozpin's will as well as his own consciousness, I'd expect him to have a very important part in the story of RWBY going forward. As a result, I feel it would have been better if an entire episode was dedicated to how he came to the decision of leaving his home, and also find out why Ozpin chose Oscar of all people to be his successor. Instead, we go from one episode where he was questioning his sanity to the next episode where he appears saying he feels it's right for him to take off on an adventure despite it seeming so crazy. And this without really having a reason why he's the chosen one. In conclusion, while I did find that there were very obvious issues with the story of Volume 4, there were still aspects of it which I appreciated. But what I feel is most important of all is the amount of enjoyment that I got from it. Those of you who've been following my theories and reviews since episode 1 will know that I did get a lot of enjoyment from this volume. That being said, I feel that previous volumes were still stronger in this regard as well. As my final verdict, I give the story and writing a score of 6 out of 10. The score would certainly be higher if Rooster Teeth didn't exaggerate the time skip. If the skip was something more sensible such as a few weeks, this volume would easily have a score of 8 out of 10 because a lot of the things that happen in it would make more sense. And it's also worth mentioning that 8 out of 10 is more than I can say for the first 2 volumes of RWBY. The next aspect I want to talk about is the animation. As you've seen, the animation changed drastically in Volume 4, and the reason being the switch from Poser to Maya. The way I see it, there are 2 aspects of animation rather than it being a single aspect in and of itself. Those are design and choreography. Now, the styles and designs of the characters are a bit of a mixed bag for me. The new style has its pros and cons over the old style in previous volumes. The most noticeable difference is that the new style features shading on the character models. This is something we didn't see in previous volumes, and it gives the designs a greater feeling of depth. Because of this, RWBY now has actual skin complexion and doesn't look like a ghost anymore. The expressions on the characters have also become a lot smoother thanks to this transition, which is something I enjoyed quite a lot. That said, the expressions shown by characters in previous volumes were also very well done, so in this regard, I'd say Poser and Maya were about even. On the other hand, and this is just a personal preference of mine, the depth of color on the designs doesn't appeal to me as much as it did in previous volumes. The designs do look a lot smoother now, but I preferred the textures of the characters in the older volumes better because the color contrast was a lot more noticeable. This gave the characters a greater sense of individuality considering the importance of colors in the show, particularly given that every character is named after a color. In Volume 4, the tone was more subdued or saturated, which didn't give the characters the striking appearance that they had in previous volumes. Most people will agree that the choreography suffered a lot in this volume, and much of it stems from Monty's absence. In previous volumes, the way characters moved during combat felt real because of the impression of weight that they gave. Characters moved in such a way that was both unreal given what they were capable of, but also moved in a way that felt real because their movements respected gravity and physics. A prime example of this is when you compare Yang during her trailer and during her nightmare scene in this volume. In the trailer, Yang's movements were complete whenever she punched because you can tell that she was moving her entire body, giving the appearance that she was generating force through her waist and her hips. In the nightmare scene, she was moving only her arms when punching toward Adam, so when you compare that to Yang's previous showings, it comes off as though she's not even taking it seriously. Granted, the context of the two scenes were very different. Typically, more effort is put into the fight choreography during an actual fight scene in RWBY over story scenes, and the nightmare scene was not a fight scene. However, there are other examples of characters not respecting physics during fight scenes in Volume 4, predominantly whenever a character would perform an aerial attack. In such cases, it's no longer uncommon for characters to appear to go from 0 to terminal velocity in a split second. This never happened in previous volumes, and I can see why it wouldn't sit well with a lot of the fanbase. After all, much of RWBY's appeal was the unique style of choreography which is no longer present in Volume 4. I give the animators some leeway in this regard because it's extremely difficult to match Monty's skill with choreography. But I would think even instances like the ones I mentioned are glaring faults that animators with even a quarter of Monty's skill should be able to avoid. That is, if they want to give the choreography a sense of realism. The change in style of choreography might in fact be deliberate, but like I said, one of the appealing things about RWBY is how the fight scenes look so real despite being so unreal, if that makes any sense. The only fight that I truly enjoyed purely for its choreography was Blake and Sun against the Sea Dragon. While the animation did have its faults and displayed some of the things I mentioned just now which make the fight seem too unrealistic, I did get a sense that the fight scene was reminiscent of previous volumes. I especially enjoyed Sun's and Blake's uses of their semblances, particularly with the fact that Blake used her semblance to propel herself into the air. This was very different from the way she's been shown using her semblance because we'd never seen Blake's clones take material form and interact with the world around them without being merged with dust. And I suppose Crow vs. Tyrion was also a really good fight. On the other hand, the choreography outside of fight scenes is certainly much better than what it was in the older volumes. I want to compare Volume 1 of RWBY to Volume 4 because Volume 1 was the first case in which Poser was used for the series, and Volume 4 is of course the first case of Maya being used. To put it simply, the worst sequences of Volume 4 were still much better than the worst parts of Volume 1. Given this, I fully expect that the animators now working with Maya will get better, and we may see the choreography improving even further over the course of the show. In conclusion, my overall score for animation of Volume 4 would have to be 6 out of 10 as well. While the fight choreography left much to be desired, it's also worth noting that the animation remained consistent throughout the entire volume, unlike previous volumes, particularly the first two. The animation in the earlier volumes had very obvious highs and lows, unlike Volume 4. I value consistency quite a lot as well, which is why the animation of Volume 4 gets a score that's slightly above average. Finally, we arrive at sound, music, and voice acting. The sound effects were certainly very good, and never did I get the sense that something sounded differently than what you'd expect. As far as music goes, Jeff Williams once again did a great job with the score, especially with the song during the final scene with RWBY's monologue. I admit that I didn't pay particular attention to the lyrics of most of the songs in this volume, but I did appreciate that they always hinted at something pertinent to the story. An example of this is the theme that played during the fight scene between Crow and Tyrion, which hinted at Crow's semblance. The voice acting was also very well done and made the characters very believable. I especially enjoyed the interactions between Yang and Tai. I could tell from those scenes that Bernie and Barbara enjoyed working together a lot, and that really helped establish their characters. I even almost fell for when Tai joked about Yang having lost a few brain cells along with her arm. Sick burn, Tai. Sick burn. Bernie certainly has a lot of experience after years of portraying Church in RWBY, so having a part in RWBY evidently felt very natural for him, and I honestly can't imagine anyone else playing Tai at this point. So as far as sound, music, and voice work goes, I give this a score of 8 out of 10. The only real fault I can find in this is the fact that while I really do enjoy the score, listening to it on its own can become very repetitive very quickly. For the scores of volumes 1 through 3, I can only find myself giving them a listen to once or twice before I move on to listening to something else. While it's very fitting for the show, it's not something I find myself listening to for its own sake. Again, this may have to do with my own personal preference, so this is strictly my opinion, well, just like everything else in this video. Therefore, my final score for this volume as a whole is 7 out of 10, which is simply a rounded average of all the previous scores, so don't dwell too much on this number. I certainly enjoyed this volume despite all of its inconsistencies, and all the fights were enjoyable to watch despite its faults. Above all, I have faith that things are going to improve just as they always have. My reason for saying this is because RWBY has also been improving consistently over time, even after Monty stopped working on the show since volume 10. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. Let me know what your thoughts are on volume 4 in the comments section, like the review if you did, subscribe to my channel as there are more things to come, and hopefully I shall see you around.